Driver, start your engine! In the beginning, stock cars outran the police to deliver the hooch to our ancestors. So sweet. Are you ready for a trip down victory lane, where Richard Petty's winnings were insane and Dale Earnhardt put everyone to shame? Canadian Junior Handley is in the Hall of Fame. Live from Haldeman County, it's time for the Driver in Deep podcast. Are you ready?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of Driver in Deep, brought to you by wingnutsports.com. Mark here along with Alex, and our guest today needs no introduction. He's a Hall of Fame motorsports journalist, Norris McDonald. What a storied career Norris has had, Alex. He's seen it all, and I can't wait to hear about this journey.
Yeah, me either. Just think of the evolution of media on the media side of that, the sport of motorsports that he has witnessed, all the way from a pen and paper to where it is now digitally. It's crazy to think about what he saw. So looking forward to hear what he's got to say on today's show.
Yeah, that this digital technology allows smucks like us to have a podcast. So I'm not sure if it's better or not, but it's certainly, you're right, it's changed. And, maybe we should invite everybody to join us on our Facebook page, Alex.
Yeah, no, good point. Before we get started, that's a great idea. Just a reminder, everybody, join us online on our Facebook page. Just search for Wingnut Sports and like the page so you can get updates, etc.
Yep, that's right. And we're also on both YouTube and Instagram at Wingnut Sports. And if you haven't checked out our YouTube page, go to YouTube and search for Wingnut Sports, and you'll find all of our past podcasts online there as well.
And also, if all else fails, just visit our website at wingnutsports.com, and you'll find all of our episodes there. And check out the show notes, as we always remind you, for links to both our guests and all their social media contact info.
That's right. But before we get to Norris, we haven't really talked too much. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how your week's been going?
Week's been okay. Probably better than yours, since your Toronto Blue Jays are out, just like I predicted. And of course, you always tell me how you almost made the show. I think you played Little League in St. Catharines or something, and there were scouts in Ontario, so you thought you almost made the show. But anyways, having said that, I know nothing about baseball. You always remind me about that, but I sure seem to predict properly.
Yeah, well, maybe that's because you don't think you have anything to learn about the game. It's been said many times, Alex, by many people, that you need to have a certain intelligence level to understand and appreciate the game of baseball. And from what you just said, you don't understand or appreciate it. And as for your predictions, you only predict the opposite of the Blue Jays, probably just to spite me and Gibber. And let's face it, if you could actually predict the outcome of a 162 game season that comes down to the last inning, you'd be rich.
Where's the money? I did.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. And let me just say this. It's been great watching the Jays. This team's been smashing the ball all over the ballpark this year. We got some great young talent that, by all accounts, exceeded expectations for the whole year. A year where they played their home games in 3 different cities. I believe that, at this time of year, the Jays were the best team in baseball, and I think all the other teams would have been scared to play them. But next year, with an entire season at home in Toronto, I'm predicting right here that they're going to win 100 games. So don't forget that.
Yeah, whatever. I've told our listeners about your super fandom and how jaded your views are, because you can't look at stuff realistically. I like the Blue Jays as well. I told you they weren't going to make playoffs. They didn't. I told you that Vladdy wasn't going to win the Triple Crown. He didn't. Of course, your boy Double R, Robbie Ray, has, he's up for the Cy Young. And I think he'll only get that probably because he's the last pitcher to lose this year. The MVP vote, how does a team that doesn't even make the playoff have an MVP? I don't know. Anyways,
Well,
Thank God.
so just to respond to that quickly, maybe Robbie Ray's going to win because he's the only pitcher that's under 3 earned runs per game. Nobody else is even close to him. And at the end of the year, you're right. Everybody else that was close to him lost. And in important games, did Robbie Ray? No,
Yes.
he didn't.
Yes.
And you're trying to tell me, by the way, he doesn't have enough wins. Wins has nothing to do with your performance when pitchers only go 7 innings. And let's face it, the Jays, if they're going to take the next step forward, are going to have to build the kind of bullpen that's going to hold these games.
You sound like a Leaf fan, buddy.
Well,
All
I
this
hope not,
talent
because if that's the case, you
underachieved.
may as well just shoot me now.
The only difference between the Blue Jays and the Leafs, at least the Leafs can make the playoffs. Anyways, listen, whatever. You're so jaded. All I can say is thank God for the Buffalo Bills, or would have to get Jody to hide all the bed sheets at your place.
Yeah, whatever that means. Yeah, but yes,
Dude,
another
you'd be hanging
dominant
out
win
the
by the
bedroom
Bills, 40-0. What a great start to the season. Why don't we talk about disc golf? You forgot to mention that. And, I do have some disc golf news.
Really?
Yeah, I signed up and I'm just waiting on my PDGA number. And very soon I'm going to be a ranked amateur. And hopefully, as soon as I get my new studio set up, I'll be able to get back out there and play too.
So PDGA, for those that are listening that don't know, is Professional Disc Golf Association. So does this mean now that every time we play, you're going to be that guy filling out a score sheet so that you can track your atrocious record, so you can be ranked?
Basically, yeah, that's what it's going to be like. And you're going to be right behind me, I have no doubt, because every time you say something contrary, oh, you're the guy that's going to have that bag with all the discs walking around the course. This is all I need right here. Well, guess what? Not only do you have the discs, you had to have one of those new P2s putters when they came out on day one. So come on. You're right there with me.
P2. How many do you have? 5, 6 or something?
I have 2. How many do you have?
1. Oh, I got 2 now.
Yeah, I know you got another one. I know.
So if you're going to start going by all these rules, I can barely stand playing with you now, like I say, because you're like watching baseball. It takes you 10 minutes to throw a disc. And just remind you, if you're going to play by the rules and be a PDGA ranked amateur, whatever you think you're going to be, just so you know, there's a 30-second rule that you have to throw your disc.
So I have about 25 seconds left after I throw it.
So you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have to adjust your game already.
Yeah. Don't worry about my game. Worry about yours.
Anyways, there's nothing to worry about on my end. It sucks. But, like you say, we haven't played. But it gets dark so early now, it's hard to get out. And every time it's a weekend comes along that I have time or we have time, it's raining. So I don't know. Mm-hmm. Hopefully this weekend, it's a long weekend, I think, coming up here. Tyler, our son's coming home from school, so maybe we'll all be able to get out and play. And I don't know about you, but it seems like Sandy and Joni play more than us now.
I think it's great. They both started playing in a group. I think they were on Monday nights, and I think they're going to move over to the weekend soon with the clocks going back and so on. It only makes sense. And they're playing right here close to home at La Fortune near Caledonia. The only thing is that means now when I go to play disc golf and go to Wiggy's, now it's costing me twice as much because they're coming along with us.
Yeah, no kidding.
But no, they're both doing great. And you know what? They're probably going to be kicking our ass soon.
No doubt. All right. I'm super excited to welcome in our next guest, who I refer to, as many others do, the godfather of motorsports journalism. He's a Hall of Famer, a racer, historian, a father, a husband, a great guy, among other things, Norris McDonald. Welcome to Driver in Deep, Norris.
Thanks very much for having me here this morning, fellas. And I'll try to, with that introduction, I'll try to do you proud.
Oh, I'm sure you will.
I can tell you one thing. I've never had an introduction from Alex Nagy anywhere near that. But hi, Norris. My name's Mark, and welcome to the show. And I just want to start off by acknowledging that, you've had such a long career and covered so much that I really don't even know where to begin. So I thought I'd begin at the beginning. I believe your first newspaper gig was in Aurelia, covering an ice race at a winter carnival back in 1962. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and how you became a motorsports fan?
Well, first of all, how I became a motorsports fan. I can tell you this, I did not come from a racing family. Neither my father or my mother was the least bit interested in the sport. But when I was 10, I went to the movies with my dad, and one of the double features was called The Big Wheel, and it starred Mickey Rooney about an Indianapolis racer. And I saw that movie, and I was instantly hooked. And from then on, I devoured everything that I could read, that I could talk to people about, having to do with really what has become the passion of my life, other than the woman I'm married to. And in 1962, I was a general reporter on the Aurelia Packet and Times. It was my first job out of high school. A lot of us didn't go to journalism school in those days. And I was assigned to cover the Winter Carnival, which was held on Lake Couchiching. And one of the attractions of the Winter Carnival was a car race on ice, which was won by a fellow named Bill Brack, who went on to become a 3-time Canadian driving champion, and probably, I think, one of the top 10 Formula Atlantic drivers of all time. And I met Bill, and over the years, it's kind of been a great ride, because anytime I had to was having trouble getting an interview with somebody, or I didn't know the answer, I could call him up, and we were away to the races. And then, of course, later on that summer, well, I shouldn't say later on that summer, in the spring, was the Players 200, the first professional sports car race at what was then Mosport, and I was there as a fan. Wasn't the Aurelia Packet and Times wasn't going to assign me to cover that race.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't realize that the winner of that was Bill Brack. And I told Mark before, like, I cannot believe, and that's why I said historian. I know you don't refer yourself as a historian per se, but I cannot believe the stuff and the names you remember. I can barely remember what I did yesterday, but that's just awesome. And you talked about that Grand Prix at Mosport as a fan, Norris. That must have been something, as a young guy going to that big event. It must have been crazy there. Tell us about that experience.
Well, first of all, it was the first big race. Sterling Moss was there. Joe Bonnier was there. Olivier Gendebien was there, racing against the top Canadian races of the time, the Ludwig Heimraths, for example. And Ludwig, who died recently, finished fourth in that race behind these big names from Europe, and became a Canadian favorite as a result of that. But it was absolutely a madhouse. Nobody expected that as many people were going to show up, and it's hard to say exactly how many people have ever gotten their way into Mosport. There's no seating, of course, so you can't keep track, but it was certainly north of 50,000, and they were not prepared. The promoters, players, cigarettes were not prepared for the mob that showed up, and they had all this money and nowhere to put it. And all of a sudden they were panic stricken, because they thought to themselves, there might be a bad guy in this crowd who's putting two and two together. And so they phoned the credit union in Bowmanville and said, can we come and leave this money in your credit union till Monday, and then we'll take it out and put it in our bank? And the credit union said, how much do you figure it is? And they told him an outlandish amount, $150,000, which at that time was a fortune.
Wow.
And so they said, sure, but we're gonna charge you the interest to have it in here on the weekend. They showed up at this credit union. And with money in shopping bags and garbage bags and all the rest of it. And by the way, you told me that I could kind of slip in the odd story here. Garbage bags have a little bit of a history at Mosport. I'm not talking about putting refuse in there. The winner of the first Canadian Grand Prix was Jack Brabham of Australia in 1967. He asked, and he won at that time the fortune of 2,000 Canadian dollars. He asked for it to be paid to him in cash in a green garbage bag that he could carry back to England. I'm not making this up, to carry back to England. And somebody said, well, why can't we just give you a check? And he said, nobody at my bank in England would accept a check on a Canadian bank. And so just give me the money. So $2,000 went out of Mosport that day in a green garbage bag being carried by a gentleman who ultimately became Sir Jack Brabham.
Crazy. Yeah, hey, no point of sale machines at that time. Hey, Norris, no point of POS systems at that time. She's all cash.
Absolutely. And as I say, it's been very, very difficult. I'm going to tell you a quick story about why you've never been able to say just exactly how many people have gone to Mosport, or Canadian Tire Motorsport Park, as it's now known. Look, you've been around forever, Alex, so
Easy.
you've been the manager of racetracks, and so you know how many tickets you sell, how many seats are sold. You have a pretty good idea how many people are in the infield, so you can say X number of people came. Well, at the end in 1971, Peter Revson had won the Grand Prix, and I finished my story in what was a rudimentary press room at that time, and I turned around to the late Len Coates, who was the PR guy for Mosport at the time, and I said, how many people were here today? And he says 80,000. So this goes in, and by the way, by this time I was working on the Globe and Mail. So this goes in Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, that 80,000 people attended the Grand Prix at Mosport on the Sunday afternoon. And the next morning, I got a phone call from Harvey Hudis, who was one of two guys who ran the place in those days. He was partners with a guy named Bernie Kamen, who was a lawyer, and Harvey was the accountant, and he's apoplectic. And he says, he's screaming at me, and he's saying, who told you we had 80,000 people in there yesterday? He says, do you want to get us in trouble with Revenue Canada? He said, we had nowhere near 80,000 people in that place. I said, well, you better talk to your PR guy, because he's telling everybody. Anyway, Bernie, he settled down shortly thereafter and gave me a big lesson and taught me how to estimate a crowd, which I'm not going to go into now after we go off the air, I'll tell you. But this formula works for everything from Nathan Phillips Square in downtown Toronto to Circuit Gilles Villeneuve on Ile Notre Dame in Montreal, or the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It's pretty much foolproof. So it was a big favor he did for me that day, but it all started because his PR guy multiplied by 2 the actual number of people who were at that Grand Prix.
Wow. Norris, you cover all forms of auto racing, but open wheel racing must be one of your favorites. Which would be understandable with some of the assignments that you've had over the years. You already spoke about it, but your first large newspaper job was with the Globe and Mail, and there you covered your first Indy 500 in 1969. And then you worked the Canadian Grand Prix in 1970. How did you find out about going to Indy that year? And tell us if you, I mean, 1970, I probably don't even remember, but tell us who won and how your travel went for that event.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, this is going to take me a few minutes. I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version here. I was working at the Globe and Mail again as a general reporter. Incidentally, I have never been a sports writer who was on the motorsport beat. It's always been something that I have been fortunate to do because nobody else on the papers that I've worked at had any knowledge or any interest in covering this. So this was perfect. It went right down my alley. But in 1969, I was sitting at home, and it was a Thursday, by the way. They always ran the Indianapolis 500 on May 30th in those days. So this would have been May 29th, 1969. And the phone rang, and I picked it up, and you would recognize the voice instantly if you had ever heard it. It was Jim Vipon, the legendary sports editor of the Globe and Mail, and he said, "Norris McDonald?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "You work here, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, Jim, I do." He said, well, Dick Meadows, who was the sports columnist of the Globe and Mail in those days, has decided that he doesn't want to go to Indianapolis. Something's come up. And he suggested that you might be interested in going. And I'm thinking to myself, is the Pope Catholic? I mean, are you crazy? And he said, I made the phone call to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. You're all set up as far as credentials and the rest of it. And I said, so what, you want me to drive down, leave now, and get there tomorrow? No. He said, I want you tomorrow morning at 6:00. Be out at Toronto. Malton was the way he phrased it. That's what everybody used to call Toronto International or Pearson in those days was Malton. And he said, and go to the Millard Air hangar. And he said, ask for Mr. Bruce Millard, and he will take you down to Indianapolis. So this is great. I get out to Malton at 6:00 in the morning. I go find Mr. Millard. And I get on an old DC-3. Are you guys old enough to remember DC-3s? They were
no, I don't.
World War plane, but they were the workhorses of wartime. They never crashed. They had a lot of room for cargo. It could hold about 30 people. They moved troops around in them. Anyway, I get on the plane. And there's one other guy on the plane, Frank Orr, from the Toronto Star, who I had met at Indianapolis a couple of years earlier when I went to my first Indianapolis 500 in 1967. As I went as a fan in 67 and bumped into Frank, who was there, of course, assigned by the Star. And here we are being flown to Indianapolis, and we're the only two guys on this plane. And I'm thinking to myself, this is kind of neat that the Globe and Mail would charter a plane, and probably in partnership with the Star, to take two reporters to Indianapolis. So, of course, everybody remembers who won his one and only Indianapolis 500 in 1969, and that was Mario Andretti. And I was there, fortunately, to cover that, and was there 50 years later. This is jumping ahead. Was there when the Speedway celebrated the 50th anniversary. I was there to cover that race. But at the conclusion of the race, and by the way, in those days, there was no email, there was no text messaging. You had to write your story on typewriters and give the finished copy to the Western Union telegraph guy, who would then send it by telegram to the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star. And I go back out to what then was Weir Cook Airport. It's now Indianapolis International. And I'm no longer one of two guys on that plane. The plane is full. And it is gone to Indianapolis to pick up George Eaton and his friends who had spent the month in the in Indianapolis for the race. Now, George Eaton, of course, was of the department store Eaton's. He was out of the sport at that time because he had been called home to run the company, but had raced in Formula One back in the late 60s and was embarking on an IndyCar career when his mom called him and said, "You've had your fun, now you have to come home and run the company." But anyway, George and his friends are on this plane, and the plane is packed and is overloaded. Wow. And we're going down the runway for the takeoff, and I'm sitting looking out the window, and I'm sitting beside Frank Orr at this point in time, because we knew each other, and so at least we'd have something to talk about on the way back to Toronto. Didn't know really any of these other folks. And I'm looking at this row of trees approaching us as we're rumbling down this runway. And I'm convinced to this day that that plane was overloaded. But finally it goes up a little bit and it bounced. We went up a little bit further and it bounced again. And then we actually got wind under the wings and we start to take off. And I swear we cleared those trees at the end of the runway by maybe 50 yards or whatever. But as I'm catching my breath, I realize that Frank Orr of the Toronto Star and I are sitting there holding hands.
Oh, man, that must have been scary as hell, for sure. That's a great story, Norris. Listen, Oswego Speedway and the Super Modifieds are near and dear to your heart. I know that for sure, because every time I scheduled a Super Modified race here at Jacassa, it conflicted with the Toronto Indy, and you used to always phone me and give me shit saying what was going on. So I know how important that stuff is to you. But, you know, the story goes that in 1982, you thought you needed to get a feel for what it was like to be behind the wheel of a race car because you were writing about it. And I think it was around 82, you ended up going and racing a Super Modified, I think maybe even a car owner, and ultimately ended up as a track announcer at Oswego. And then ultimately, again, you know, honored. It must have been an honor because you were inducted into the Oswego Speedway Hall of Fame in 2010, which I know you were probably thrilled about. Tell us about your love of Oswego.
Well, when I was younger, back when I was hanging around Mosport, I would go to whatever was happening at Mosport. It might be the Canadian Grand Prix, and be there for the afternoon when, say, they were doing time trials, and then beetle on over to Flamborough Speedway that evening for what were the glamour cars of the Southern Ontario circuit at that time, and they were the Super Modifieds. And you had Warren Coniam and Harvey Lennox and all those guys. And I always said to myself, if I personally was ever going to go racing, I was going to go right smack dab into the Super Modifieds without having any idea what I would be getting myself into. And don't misunderstand, I wasn't right out of the box here. I had done some racing when I worked on a newspaper up in Pembroke. I got involved with racing up there and somehow wound up driving a stock car for a guy who owned a service station up there, and so on. In any event, in 1982, and I always maintained that this very well might have been the beginning of the demise of my once happy first marriage. Is when I went out and you've heard that one before, haven't you? Yeah. And bought a Super Modified from a fellow in Oswego, New York, named Pat Murphy. Now Pat lived in Oswego. He was a postie there. He himself had got into racing because he'd been a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and when he got back, he just couldn't do anything that would give him the adrenaline rush that car racing, big time car racing could. And so I drove that initial super modified twice, I believe. But I got to be quite honest with you. And I had actually had two. I went on and bought a second one. But I really didn't know what I was doing. And there's a fellow in Kingston today named Don Carlisle, who really was the brains behind my operation. In any event, one night I'm in the infield at Oswego, and the track announcer, a guy named Roy Silva, came walking up to me, and the trackside announcer, who was regularly at the job, a guy named Bill Foley, for one reason or another, hadn't shown up. And Roy said, listen, you've got a good gift for the gab. Whenever we've interviewed you over the PA system, how'd you like to do Bill Foley's job tonight? And so I just became a reporter, which of course, by that time, I had been a seasoned reporter for a good number of years. But I started doing things that had never been done at Oswego before, such as interviewing drivers after wrecks while they were still on the track. I remember one time, J.J. Andrews, who was a limited super modified racer from Pembroke, he was still upside down in his car when I got down on my hands and knees, and he was in no danger. I mean, they just had to straighten him out. And but that was the beginning. And at the end of the year, Romy Caruso, one of three brothers who owned Oswego, said to me, how'd you like to do this as a full-time job? And I said, how much are you going to pay me? And he told me it was going to pay me. And I said, why didn't you tell me this when I started racing here, so I didn't blow my financial brains out trying to race a super modified? And so that's how how my trackside announcing career took off. I was in a little bit of demand for a few years, Alex. I was invited to announce at Winchester Speedway in Indiana when the USAC sprint cars were there, because Rich Vogler, you would remember him, the late Rich Vogler, he had come to race a super modified one night at Oswego and heard me talking and said, you ought to come down and do some of our races. So I did a USAC sprint car race at Winchester. And when they notified me that I was going to be inducted into the Oswego Speedway Hall of Fame, the plaque says that I have the largest vocabulary of anybody who ever worked at the place.
Norris, we spoke earlier about your first job reporting at the Indy 500, and of course,
right.
IndyCar racing has a long history here in Ontario, starting out at Mosport, and now, of course, the Toronto Indy.
Right.
And I can't remember how it went, but I heard you tell the story on a podcast with Sam and Ron Fellows on how the Toronto Indy event almost started downtown earlier than it did, but it was stopped somewhere around 1968. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. And way to go. You've got the timeline correct. A lot of people don't realize, but the Indy cars came to Mosport before the Formula One cars. The Indy cars came in June. They got rained out, which resulted in a massive traffic jam of people going back to Toronto. Sorry, fellas. I'm actually in my car here, and I just had to start paying attention. I'm coming up behind some cars. But two guys, George Eaton, we mentioned him before. He was interested in going big time racing, but he also was interested in promoting racing as well. And John Bassett Jr., Johnny F. Bassett, who was the son of John Bassett, who owned the late Toronto Telegram. And they had a couple of drinks one night and said, listen, this is fabulous. Why are we sending everybody up north of Bowmanville? Why don't we just have it? We'll race it right down here and where the CNE is. We'll have the pits running through the grandstand. We're talking real ancient history, of course, because the grandstand hasn't been there for a number of years. It's been replaced by BMO Stadium. In any event, the aforementioned Harvey Hudis and Bernie Kamen heard about this and realized that their business would go right down the drain if these two guys from Toronto were able to scoop the two biggest attractions at Mosport out from under their feet. And by this time, Bassett and Eaton had been to Toronto Council and had received tacit approval to do this starting in 1968. And the only way that the Mosport people saw that they could stop this from happening was to get what was known as the Parkdale Ratepayers Organization. And the CNE is in a part of Toronto known as Parkdale. If they could get the Parkdale Ratepayers Association against this, then there was a good chance that it wouldn't happen in 1968. And they went to a meeting of this Ratepayers Association and whipped them into a frenzy that the noise would be unbelievable, forgetting, of course, that we have a massive air show down there every year. And the Hells Angels were going to ride into town and kidnap all their daughters and do unspeakable things, and got these people so upset that they went to city council and said, if you give the go-ahead for this race, none of you will ever be reelected in this town because we will start now and we will not finish until the next election, and we will get rid of you all. And scared Toronto City Council into saying to George Eaton and Johnny Bassett, you can't do this. And that's how they managed to do it the first time. There's several times that big time racing almost came to Toronto, and one thing or another held it up. In 1977 or 78, I'd have to check the date on this one, but a couple of promoters were going to pull a race in the World Challenge Sports Car Championship down at the CNE. And their deal with Mosport was that they would cut Mosport in on the action. And so here you have Bernie Kamen and Harvey Hudis going back to the same Ratepayers Association in Parkdale and saying, things have changed, everything's okay now. And they said, listen, you said no the first time, you said second time. And then, of course, when and this is really interesting, in 1977 at Mosport, the place really had become unsafe. Formula One cars were hitting guardrails, which were breaking the wooden standards that they were attached to and breaking. Ian Ashley went off at the end of the Mario Andretti straight and was just about killed when his car hit a TV station, a TV camera. And so Bernie Ecclestone, who was really running things at that time, let it be known that they would not return to Canada if they had to come back to Mosport. The president of Labax, which sponsored the race at that time, the president of Labax, who was from Montreal, wanted to move it to Toronto to guess where. And somebody at the CNE called up city council again and said, a race here has never been approved. And so Toronto City Council said, no, we don't want the Grand Prix. Can you imagine a more stupid decision than that? And of course, the next day, they called Mayor Drapeau of Montreal, the world's greatest big city mayor, by the way. And Drapeau, who really didn't know anything about Formula One racing, said, we'll be only too happy to take it here in Montreal. And so this is a long history of races that were supposed to happen in Toronto that never did. And finally, the plum, the Grand Prix went to Montreal after Toronto. And by the way, if you go to the Grand Prix, somewhere in the program every year, they might have a little quarter of an inch that they have to fill at the bottom of a page. You will find City of Toronto rejects Grand Prix October 17th, 1977. City of Montreal accepts Grand Prix October 18th, 1977. In other words, sticking it to Toronto right to the very end. But you know, you can talk about this stuff forever, and the intrigue that goes on. And Alex, you know, you run a speedway. You know, back when I was talking about super modified racing in Southern Ontario, there was racetracks all over the place in Southern Ontario. Nilestown Speedway, which was a great place and so a lot of these guys could race for a living. Yeah. You know, they could race at Delaware on Thursday night and Nilestown on Friday night, and Oswego Saturday night, and Sandusky, Ohio, Sunday afternoon. And it was a big circuit. And they were eventually driven out of Ontario because they got too expensive for the promoters. And they, you know, that's why you don't see supers around here unless you bring them in. Unfortunately, you always seem to schedule them the same day that the IndyCar race is on. But we have talked about that before.
Yeah, it was a one-way conversation, pal. I didn't get a chance to talk that much, but listen, duly noted. You know, we've talked about so many different events you've covered. Is there one that you wish that you have had a chance to cover that you didn't?
Yeah, believe it or not, I was not at the first Formula One Grand Prix that Gilles Villeneuve won right here in Canada, in Montreal, in 1978. And the reason I'm sorry I wasn't there is because it was Canadian. There had been Canadians in Formula One prior to Gilles Villeneuve becoming a star in Formula One, but there had never been a Canadian winner of a Formula One Grand Prix. And so Gilles was the guy who did it, and I was a general reporter, and I had been assigned to something other and couldn't get away for the weekend. So that's always bothered me. However, have I ever told you my theory about that race? Do you guys want a scoop?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you want, and I'll tell you, there's going to be a lot of people, but it's funny. I was talking with a guy just about this 2 days ago. I would never say 100%, but there are indications by adding everything up that not everything was on the up and up in that race. You had the first race in Montreal. You had the Prime Minister of Canada there. You had Jean Drapeau there. You had Gilles Villeneuve making his first start in Montreal. You had the race being won by a guy named Jean-Pierre Jarier, who had never won and never did win a Formula One Grand Prix, who was winning by a mile. He was driving for Colin Chapman of Team Lotus, who was beside himself because he was out of money and about to be arrested by the country of Ireland. He and John DeLorean had sucked Dublin into backing a new sports car, and Chapman had used all the money he'd received up front to run his Formula One team. And all of a sudden, with about 20 laps left to go in the race, Jean-Pierre Jarier pulls into the pits, gets out of the car, and the excuse is that he noticed that his oil pressure seemed to be a little high, and he worried that he might blow the engine, as if any racing driver about to win his or her first major race is going to stop because they think that the car is going to blow up. So, of course, then Gilles Villeneuve, who was running in second place, inherited the lead and won. Now, if you think of just what I've said there, I would suggest that there was some money changed hands.
Sounds like it. Sounds like it.
I frankly don't think that it's all that easy to fix a car race, and I don't in any way suggest that this is the sort of thing that does happen. But Alex, you yourself are, pretty aware that there were questions asked twice in NASCAR Cup, Richard Petty's 200 and Dale Earnhardt's winning of the Daytona 500.
Yeah.
Both of those races could stand some examination, such as I have just suggested might be the case in Montreal in 1978.
Yeah,
Wow.
some definite questions there at those events for sure. I can tell you this, I wouldn't have pulled over if I had no oil pressure, never mind too much.
Well, and that's what I mean. It makes no sense for a guy who retired without ever winning. I mean,
Wow.
And, and as I say, the most important people of the country who never had before showed up. Trudeau showed up in 1968 when the race was at Le Circuit Mont Tremblant. But that was the only other time he came to a race, was for that race on Ile Notre Dame in 1978. So for all I know, maybe he only went to a Grand Prix every 10 years, but I suggest that there might be a little bit more to it. And oh yeah, I forgot, this is always the one that I've always killed myself laughing about. You know how in Formula One racing, of course, this goes back to, when Dan Gurney started this back in the 60s, but you know how the Formula One guys and now everybody, they shake the bottles of champagne.
Yeah.
Did you notice that Villeneuve had a oversized bottle of Labatt's 50 when he won that race?
I remember seeing pictures of that. Now that you say that, I remember seeing pictures of that.
So as I say, just add it all up.
Grand Prix
Add it all.
gate.
Hey, by the way, do you want? Yeah, if you want another little story about Canada being first in something, a Formula Atlantic race, probably in the late, I would have to check on this, either the late 90s or early 2000s, when Patrick Carpentier was driving in Formula Atlantic, and he won the race in Toronto, and he popped the cork on the champagne. And of course, champagne corks come out like rockets. And Patrick popped the cork, and it came blasting out and just missed his eye by what's half a millimeter. You know what I mean? It came so close to ending his career right there.
Wow.
And as a result of that near disaster, the corks have always been out of the bottles of champagne since, because they don't need a Michael Schumacher popping the champagne and putting his eye out.
Well, didn't know. That's another thing I didn't know. See what you learn when you talk to the Godfather.
Is that because you didn't pop too many, Alex?
I just smashed the top off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, Norris, before
wait a minute. I would always just push it in.
yeah. Before we get you out of here, I got to say, we've talked a lot about IndyCar, Formula One, different super modifieds, but just I can speak, I think, on behalf of so many different people. You've covered so many big events over your career and continue to, and God knows for how long, because it seems like you're never going to retire, which is great for our sport. But one thing that I want to thank you for is that you always make an effort, if people send you the results, to cover weekly stock car racing, smaller series that we have in this country or a province. You always make an effort to put it on your Monday morning racing roundup. And, the fact that you continue to do that, and the only one that does that is, we're super, super thankful for that, I can tell you.
Well, thank you for that, Alex. Look, the bread and butter of our sport is the grassroots. It doesn't matter in road racing, if it's kart racing. It doesn't matter if it's oval racing, it's jalopies on a Saturday night, whether it's dirt, whether it's pavement, regardless. People deserve the publicity. People deserve the congratulations when they win, and I'm just getting started. I know. I plan to keep going. I plan to keep going for a long time.
Well,
that's great.
That's good news for us. Also, we talked about the Oswego Speedway Hall of Fame, but being inducted into the Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame in 2013, I believe it was, as the first journalist, must have been pretty special.
It was probably the proudest day of my life. I had my 3 adult children there, and my first grandchild. My first grandchild, by the way, who was all decked out in an Oswego Speedway sweater.
Nice. I'm not surprised.
Everybody else was dressed properly.
Norris, I can't let you get out of here without asking you this broad bucket question here. Who is the greatest Canadian racer you ever saw?
Gosh, something. Okay. I had to hesitate there for a sec to run it through the old noggin here. No doubt, Paul Tracy. No doubt.
Wow.
And I'll tell you why. If he had been properly managed when he had that Formula One test with Benetton, if he had been represented by someone who knew Formula One, he would have become the second great Formula One. And I don't in any way mean to denigrate Gilles.
Right.
But Gilles was uphill, downhill, turn right. Tracy could drive anything and drive it well. He could drive that Formula One test. If it had been real, he would have started 4th on the grid of that year's French Grand Prix, because that is where the test was conducted. And that was just out of the box with maybe half a dozen lap warm up before they turned him loose. So he had, and the thing is, and I've said this to Paul 1,000 times, so I'm not telling any tales out of school here. If he had an ounce of the ability to take a step back, and when the car didn't have it in him, or whether he had the flu or whatever, if he had the discipline, he could have been an IndyCar champion many times over. But as I've said to him, you know, the problem with Tracy is that he would talk about points, then he put on a helmet, his brains would turn to cement, and he had to win the lap, he had to win the race, he had to do everything. And he crashed so many times when he was out. And you know, I know because I've talked to Roger Penske about Paul Tracy. And Penske will tell you. Penske will say to you right here today, Tracy had more talent than any of them, but the others could govern themselves, where Paul was just unable to pull the reins back and to win the race rather than the lap. And but I think probably two of the greatest performances I've ever seen was when Tracy, driving for Team Cool Green, and he came from the back of the pack at Road Atlanta and won.
Hello?
I think maybe his phone died.
Oh, maybe.
I'm thinking we kept him on so long we killed his battery.
Could be. Well, he ended at the end of a sentence.
He's going to need a bump start.
I'll just sum up his story there about Paul.
Some away?
Yeah, never even thought about that. Gilles was the easy pick, but Paul had so much raw talent. You're so right, thinking back, and like you say, he could drive everything. Well, buddy, listen, again, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Hopefully, like you said, you're never going to retire, because that'd leave a huge void in our industry. And on behalf of Mark and I, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, after he retires, it's going to be a huge void, Alex. Thanks for listening, everyone, to Driver and Duke.
Driver in